I live here in the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas. And the origins of the word Ouachita are actually really fascinating because when you look to the languages of the native tribes from the area, the Choctaw had the word Ouachito, which means large hunting. And then the Caddo tribe called this Ouachita, which means good hunting land. And then going from Ouachita to Ouachita was basically the French transliteration of the word because this area was controlled by France prior to the Louisiana Purchase. So that's multiple languages of people who lived in this area and called it good hunting land. Now, even to this day, we're known for the plentiful wild game and fishing we have here. I mean, it's huge here, and we even get lots of tourists coming here specifically for those purposes. So it's an area very well known for plentiful game and hunting. But yet, even still, now having lived out here in these woods, I'm not convinced that there's enough wild game here for me as just an individual person, not even a whole family or a tribe, to be able to live off of. Yeah, I do see animals pretty regularly. I encounter deer, um, but they quickly move away because they're better at stalking these woods than we are. So usually I chance upon them and then they take off quickly. And whenever I see a deer, I always ask myself, now if I had needed to, would I have had a clean shot at them? And most of the time, the answer is no. I would not have. I would have a hard time unless I was specifically spending all my time uh, towards setting up for hunting them. I would not have many opportunities. The squirrels are the same way. These aren't like your city squirrels that will come up and eat from your bird feeder. You get within 50 yards of a forest squirrel, and they're going to disappear like a fart in the wind. You keep hearing about how the southern U.S. is being overrun by feral hogs. And I'm surrounded by little streams and creeks out here, which would be ideal locations for these hogs to be passing through. And yet, I have not seen signs of even one. And I've talked to other guys in the area that I run into and have asked them about it, and they've never seen a hog either. So yeah, they named the college football team here after the critters. That's supposedly how plentiful they are. But yet, they're just because you hear that an area is full of a certain type of game does not mean you're going to see a ton of them. They may be rare there, or you know, just you're just not going to find them that often. So don't make the assumption that just because you're in a wooded area that it's just plentiful with game. Now, sure, I believe it's possible that in a survival situation, I would be able to supplement my diet with, there would occasionally you would be able to have the opportune time to bag a game animal. And of course, foraging for wild edibles. But even that is something that I've been focusing on very heavily for the last 18 months, learning how to identify the edibles in this area. And it's not just knowing what is edible, you also need to know what part of the plant is edible and at what point in its growth stage is it edible. Then once you're able to collect that, you now need to know the procedure to process that plant to make it palatable to yourself. So it's not enough to just know what is edible. You got to know everything about preparing it to make it into actual food. So even though I've been focusing hard on trying to learn that, there's just not enough calories out here in the woods for a guy to get 1,500 calories a day in. I just don't see it happening. If you want to eat after the stuff is hitting the fan, I believe that you need to be producing food ahead of that event. It's really just that simple. Now, inevitably, somebody in the comments is going to push back on my opinion with that, because it doesn't jive with their post-apocalyptic fantasy of becoming a mountain man to survive. But you got to keep in mind, this is 2025. This isn't 1825, back when the whole western half of North America was completely wild. The game numbers are way down from where they were back then, and the human population is way higher, and humans dominate everything. So, should there be a stuff hits the fan event like that, what would hunting look like? Well, I imagine that every person who owns a firearm is probably going to take shots at every single animal that they see. Now, if they happen to get lucky enough to hit it and can actually collect that animal, they're likely only going to get like one meal out of it. And then the rest of the meat's just going to spoil, because without the power grid working, they're not going to have a fridge or freezer to put the rest of the meat in. Very few people today know how to actually store meat properly, right? So most of the animals being harvested, most of that meat is just going to go to waste really quickly. And I think within a very short time, say within a month or two, the game populations would dwindle down to near extinction levels. The last time that happened during the Great Depression, here in the southeast U.S., to get the deer and wild turkey populations back up to where they needed to be took like 70 years of hard conservation to make that happen. And they're still not where they need to be. So if you think back to like how the Native Americans lived, they're always portrayed as being hunter gatherers, right? Well, again, you can't use that as a comparable for yourself, because that was a completely different era when there was all that plentiful game. And even then, they did not stay and hunt their locale. They had to constantly be on the move to follow the animals and the wild edible plants. And that information they had about the migratory patterns of the game animals and about where edible plants were growing was information that was passed down to them through generations and generations of people. You and me don't have access to that information. We don't know where the animals and the edible plants are going to be at. All we know is what's in our immediate area. So even if you live in a forested area like this, that's pretty remote, I would not depend entirely on hunting, fishing, and foraging to eat. I don't think that would work. If you want to eat after the stuff has hit the fan, you need to be producing food prior to that event. For us as survivalists and preppers, we need to be focusing on food production as a primary means of eating. And you need to be, you can't just be, okay, if you've got some tomatoes and peppers growing in your garden because you like that for making salsa. That's great. I'm not saying stop that or whatever, but that is low calorie foods. I think the focus for a survival garden needs to be on calorie dense foods. When you look back at those Native Americans who nobody ever mentions it, they were actually very good farmers. All the records show that they collected seeds, and when they moved around, they would plant. And almost all of the food sources that they planted were calorie dense foods that contained fats and proteins in them, like field corn, not sweet corn, that tasty corn on the cob that you like, but the field corn that can be ground down into like cornmeal, beans, squash, potatoes, sunflower seeds, high calorie, high fat, high protein foods. I'm willing to bet that they probably weren't as much hunter gatherers as the we've always been told. I'd be willing to bet that the majority of their calories probably came from those staple crops that they harvested, and then the hunting, fishing, and wild foraging was just kind of a supplementary thing to those staple crops. And I think that should be our focus. If you want to keep doing the tomatoes and peppers and low calorie stuff like that, that's great. Just acknowledge that that is your hobby garden. That's not your survival garden. That's totally different things. And another thing to take into consideration, when I see modern gardeners, they put so much effort into producing their food, right? They're starting seeds and then eventually transferring it out. And then while it's growing, they're weeding, they're irrigating, they're pruning, doing all this work, and then the harvesting and processing and everything. All of that work is burning calories to do that, okay? So say you get to the end of the season and you get a cucumber to eat. That cucumber is going to contain about 20 calories in it. Well, if during the course of the season you put 50 or 100 calories of work into producing those 20 calories, it doesn't take a mathematician to figure out that you can have food available to you and still end up in starvation mode. So, in addition to growing the calorie dense foods, I think we need to develop methods where we have minimal amount of input to go into producing it, right? Uh, like weeding. I don't understand why people weed. I mean, most weeds are actually edible. I think it's better to instead learn about edible weeds. So then any weeding you do, instead of weeding a dandelion, you're basically pulling it to eat, because it's food. So yes, I think obviously it's important to have good hunting skills. You need to learn how to do that. You need to learn how to identify and process wild edible foods, because how to fish, because any opportunity you have to collect calories is going to be valuable to you. But I would not rely solely on those and living off the land, like they say. Um, I think that's just a fantasy, and it's kind of a lie that the survivalist community has been perpetuating for way too long. I see that too often in videos and forums where people are pushing that you need to be able to live off the land. I don't see it happening. It's just the math does not line up for me. And I think a lot of that information put out there is kind of untrustworthy too. Like I saw this interview where this guy who's been off-grid living in Alaska for a long time. I mean, he's like a true mountain man type. He was telling the story about this woman he knows that ended up on one of those survival Alaska shows. You've heard about them. There's been multiple surviving in Alaska, whatever TV shows. She was a coworker of his. So he's like, oh yeah, my coworker's on television. Of course, you're going to tune in and check it out and see what happens. And he said when he watched it, he could not believe it, because like there was an episode where she was out fishing on the river and the narrator was saying something along the lines of, now, if she does not collect some salmon here today, her family could starve over the winter. And he's like, what are they talking about? She lives 9 miles from Aldi's. Like, she actually drove further to go fishing in the river than she would have to just drive to the grocery store. So there is no risk that woman was going to starve. Okay? So don't listen to any of that stuff. It is all a lie. You just can't trust any of that survival stuff, because it's they've got to push the dramaticism of it. So I'm telling you, it's all a lie. I'm just trying to share with you, having actually lived in the woods my opinion that there is just not enough calories naturally growing here to survive off of. You, as a prepper or survivalist, need to be focusing on food production, specifically calorie dense foods full of uh, fats and proteins and livestock. And again, livestock that you can feed yourself. If you've got backyard chickens that you're currently buying feed from the feed store for, that's great now, but what happens when the feed store closes and you don't have food for them anymore? You stop feeding the chickens, they stop producing eggs. So we need to be producing our own food, our own livestock, and the food for our livestock, and trying to develop it in a system where it requires the least amount of calories burned for us to do it. It's just my opinion.